In 1940, the fortress of Terezin, also known by its German name of Thereseinstadt, was adapted by the Nazis as a ghetto concentration camp. It would be 70 years marking the infamous Red Cross visit to Thereseinstadt, and we talked about the fact that there was this association of music with the camp, that so many composers and musicians had been interned at Terezin, and the idea of a concert came to mind. Terezin was an old fortress in what was then Czechoslovakia, and in 1941 the Germans turned it into, it was actually a combination of a ghetto and concentration camp.
It was a place, in consequence, that became fairly easy to contain and to make use of as a containment camp, if not a traditional concentration camp for the Third Reich.
The difficulty that the Germans had at the time was that there were Jews in Germany, in Czechoslovakia, that even in this horrific time were still somewhat admired. You had, for instance, German Jewish war heroes in World War I. There were many German Jews who had fought on the German side who were decorated war heroes. The conditions were still very, very difficult in this camp. But the Germans pretended that the conditions were somewhat better. And when the people were offered, in some cases, to the possibility of going into this camp, they were fooled. So they were told that it was like a spa. And in particular, there were many elderly people that were sent to this camp. So, for instance, they were offered to rent an apartment, and they were asked to choose between a northern exposure or a particular view. It was orchestrated to that extent.
We would have French Jews, for example, who would think that this was a way for them to come to some kind of possible future, to avoid any kind of fate that might be either death or worse than death. So the scam begins with actually preparing Jews to go to a new life. Be sure they packed their suitcases, be sure they brought their instruments, be sure that they could pick up where they left off in this new home as resettlement processes were being planned for them.
And of course that wasn't the case at all. Disease was rampant, there was severe overcrowding, and people had to work long, hard hours in the camp. And it was, in fact, it wasn't Auschwitz, it wasn't an extermination camp, but it was a labor camp, and people worked very hard.
So essentially the scam begins from the very first instance as people were being arrested and corralled and shipped to the east, first to Terezin, and then of course later on to Auschwitz and certain death in the chambers. Insofar as you can talk about what ultimately is still a concentration camp by any other name, the inmates were more cherry-picked, if you like. There was, I think, always the intent to make use of Terezin as a showpiece to distract the attention of the Allies from what was actually being carried out as of really 1942, first by Heydrich and then by his successors as the extermination of the Jewish people in Europe. So that in this particular case, the idea was to at least have at the Nazis' disposal people who could simply by essence of their past life and their capabilities help to perpetrate this extraordinary fraud on the rest of the world.
You had very famous composers and musicians, and even in the midst of the Shoah, it was difficult for the Germans to summarily send these people off to Auschwitz. And so these people were put into this ghetto concentration camp. there were just these many talented musicians, artists, poets who made up the population of the camp. And this, of course, changed the entire tenor of the camp itself, and I imagine how people felt being exposed to this kind of music, of poetry, of art. During the day, people were forced to work very, very hard. But in the evening, these very talented people, the artists and the musicians, tried to continue with the interests that they had before the camp.
Those who were musicians, those who were poets, still attempted to practice their particular skills and their vocations. But again, this was not because they were encouraged to do so or given the resources to do so. Quite the contrary. They did this in spite of incalculable odds.
So this is where the story actually of the Requiem comes in, because you have this young musician by the name of Raphael Schechter, this 29-year-old conductor, who brought his musical scores with him. And one day he discovered a piano in a dark, dank cellar. He, earlier on, decided that he wanted to help people. He wanted to give them hope. And so he invited people who sang to go down in the evenings to this cellar. And originally he began to tap into their patriotism, their Czech patriotism, by singing Czech songs, such as songs by the Czech composer Smetana. And they did this very often, and eventually he pulled out his score of the Verdi Requiem and taught them the Requiem in Latin. He explained to them word for word what this Latin Mass meant, and he couldn't write any of it down on paper, couldn't write the notes down, and he taught it to them.
Note by note and piece by piece, line by line, nuance by nuance, was in itself perhaps the most rewarding thing that had happened to them, not simply since the war began, or since Hitler assumed power, but possibly ever in their lives. That here were people who were demeaned, who were demonized, who were dehumanized, who were nevertheless engaged in one of the most profound activities that human beings can undertake, the making of music. Music that is not simply beautiful, but actually that transcends the mundane and the terrible, which is the very nature of a Mass, and particularly perhaps of Verdi's Mass.
It's a beautiful, very difficult piece of music. It's a Mass for the dead, and it speaks of divine justice. It also speaks of, there's a point in the piece where it says in Latin, liberame, liberate us, free us. And this spoke very much to Schechter when he wanted to perform it. But it's also it's a very Christian piece of music. It's a Catholic piece, of course. And when Schechter spoke to the elders of the camp and told them that this was the piece that he wanted to perform, they were aghast. They didn't want him to perform it for two reasons. The first one being the message of the music, because they were very worried that the Nazis would understand that he was speaking of this divine justice against evil, but also because it was a Christian piece, and they thought this is the one opportunity that we have to speak to the world. Why not perform something that isn't quite so Catholic? But he got his way. And some of the choristers that survived, however, also felt that as they were singing, it sunk in that this Mass for the dead, that they were singing their own Mass, that they would soon be dead. And in fact, many of them did die very shortly afterwards. They were shipped off.
One of the observations that has to be made about the Requiem is that it's a complex piece of music. extraordinarily complex piece of music.
And at times, people that made up this group of choristers were sent to extermination camps, and so new people came into the chorus. One of the survivors said that the music nourished their souls, and that this was all that was needed, that more than food, that music was all that was needed to nourish their souls. And so this really, it meant so much to them.
By 1943, the settlement was thriving, and of course this led to the visit of the Danish Red Cross in 1944.
Most of the Jews of Denmark, of course, were saved by the Danes in that they were shipped off to Sweden in boats. But there were some that were captured. And so the King of Denmark was concerned about his subjects, and it was upon his interest. He wanted the Red Cross to visit the camp because he was concerned about their safety. So that is how the Red Cross got there. And the Nazis, of course, wanted to convince, it was their opportunity to convince not only the Red Cross, but the rest of the world that in fact, the rumors of these camps were nothing but rumors.
Well, the role of the Red Cross, whether in that conflict or when it emerged in the late 19th century, was primarily to provide impartial relief to combatants and to civilian victims, to collateral damage on both sides of any kind of conflict. And that very neutrality made them seem to the Western world, and permitted them to be used by the Third Reich as apparently impartial observers to the fate of Jews within Europe. Perfect observers, in fact, of what was happening in Terezin. Perfect, of course, if you don't consider the dynamics of abuse under which the inhabitants, the residents, the interns, were the conditions in which they were living.
They took every opportunity to choreograph this wickedly down to the last detail, such as this soccer game where they told the children to score a goal at the exact moment that the Red Cross delegation passed.
The horror of this whole experience, the visit, of course, is that, that people really were, in some respects, I suppose, particularly, I'd want to argue, the children, given a taste of what life ought to have been for them. The idea of actually being given a ball to play with so that they could go out and pick up teams and play football. The tidying up, the making sure the gardens were arranged. It would have been, amongst other things, perhaps the first outlet for really creative activity that folk had had in the camp, or not just in the camp, wherever they had been before they were corralled and brought to Terezin for several years.
I think it must have been horrible. I think that people were so desperate to tell the outside world what was going on, and that on the one hand, they felt that this was their only opportunity, and hoping against all hope that someone on that delegation of the Red Cross could see through what was happening, and probably thinking, can't they see what's going on here? Don't they understand this is a concentration camp and that this can't possibly be true, that this must be a facade, and yet being absolutely terrified, and that they were warned that if they said one word to this delegation, that they would immediately be killed. And then in fact, so many of them immediately, I mean, the day after the delegation left, all of these facades were taken down, these storefronts were taken down, the gardens were destroyed, and thousands upon thousands were shipped off to the death camps the following days.
It's something for which the temptation in retrospect is certainly to fault the Danish Red Cross. And it is hard to imagine anyone who served on that mission not following the end of the war, when the revelations became complete, being utterly broken by what they missed. If the primary aspect of your life is fear, imagine how in a place like Terezin, where every waking moment is marked primarily by waiting for the next terrible thing to occur, by living with a gnawing hunger, with terrible cold, with isolation, with a complete sense of insecurity, that there was absolutely nothing on which you could rely except perhaps the hope of death. Imagine that what you were being asked to do was to somehow put on a facade that said, no, everything is all right, we're being treated relatively well, we have opportunities for culture, we have sports field, we can play soccer, we can dress well, we can enjoy fresh air, we have sculpted gardens available to us. Why, it's almost as though we were on holiday at Baden-Baden. To try and both endure this impossible dehumanization and at the same time to put on a facade that went beyond your capacity to be a human. In a sense, it's a mirror image, one of the other.
They were able to speak directly to the Nazis, singing to the Nazis and telling them, this is what awaits you, divine justice. You may think that you're getting away with something, even if we die, even if you send us to our deaths. There is a justice that awaits you. One day you'll be before God, and there's divine justice. You can't get away with this, even though you think, even if you don't believe in God, we believe in God, and we believe that there's a punishment that awaits you. And they were able to say that directly to them.
Choose to During the war, Michael Flach survived both the ghetto, where he ran a children's home, and Birkenau and Buchenwald. After he was liberated, he became a university teacher, among other things. This is the fifth poem from the Terezin children's cantata by Michael Flach. The heaviest wheel rolls across our foreheads to bury itself deep somewhere inside our memories. We've suffered here more than enough, here in this clot of grief and shame, wanting a badge of blindness to be a proof for their own children. A fourth year of waiting, like standing above a swamp from which any moment a spring might gush forth. Meanwhile, the rivers flow another way, not letting you die, not letting you live. And the cannons don't scream, and the guns don't bark, and you don't see blood here, nothing. Only silent hunger. Children steal the bread here and ask, and ask, and ask, and all would wish to sleep, keep silent, and just go to sleep again. The heaviest wheel rolls across our foreheads to bury itself deep somewhere inside our memories.
Before, I was happy. We had a home, and I had my mother and father, and I had a grandmother just an hour away by train. We had a big family. My mother had 6 sisters and brothers. The Germans came into Hungary all on the same day. So my mother was on a boat going to Budapest. They took her off the boat, and the next day she died because she was a diabetic and they didn't give her the insulin. She was 31 years old. So my aunt looked after me and my brother, and they took us right away to the Jewish school where they gathered all the Jews, and 3 days later they put us on the cattle train. The last minute they put the old folks home and they died. And the cattle train didn't stop for 3 days. To be hungry is one thing, but to be thirsty, you have no idea what it's like. And they wouldn't give us any water. And if somebody peed or if they had to make, so whoever was at the window, they had a little can and they used to pour it out. And the people that died, they were locked in with us, the old people. For 3 days, the train only stopped at the station when they got water, the people that were driving it, but for us they wouldn't give any. We thought that we were the only one taken. We didn't know. I mean, I knew my mother was dead, but I didn't know about my father. They bombed the train line. They were supposed to be taken to Auschwitz, but because they bombed the train tracks, they took us off and they put us to a place called Schwarzenau for 3 days. And there we had to get undressed naked for 3 days. And they went in, and we lost my brother because they put the men separate. And they went into all the ladies' vagina and their rectum. They were looking for diamonds. And then after 3 days, we could get dressed. And then somebody from our hometown looked after my brother, and we found him again. And they took us to a place called Gudgajvic, where we have to work in the fields for about 3 months. And there, they used to go hunting, and we had to go, my brother and me, just the young people, to go with a stick to hit the bushes so the rabbits should run out, and they would be shooting the rabbits. And we had to be careful because sometimes they caught the people. And after Gudgaiwitz, the Russians were coming. So this is when we walked for a month, steady all the time. There was some people, they ate the grass and they went sick. And then finally we got to Thereseinstadt. And there, when we got there, they put us up to a building where it was 3 floors, and we were in the top floor because we were the last, and the older people were in the bottom. Because we were the last one to get in there, we didn't do anything. We were just laying there hungry on on bunkers, you know, just a little bit straw on it. And that was it. And when it came mealtime, we had to go and stand in line for hours to get something, you know. And most of the time what we had is the sauerkraut soup, you know. No, the only time you get a real meal when the Red Cross came. Then you got everything. You got a piece of meat and you got a potato. Oh, we're dying for a potato. They chose the people that knew how to play music or pianos or sing. When the Red Cross came, they usually gave us a good meal that day, and then the people had to entertain them, and that was for a day. And when the Red Cross went away, then they put those people on the trains and they went to Auschwitz. And that's the way it went, but the Red Cross didn't come often. They just came once in a while. In the meantime, we were starving. What could we do? We knew it was a show, and they never give a chance to any one of us to talk to them. They would look at the people that entertained them, you know, but they weren't allowed to talk to them. But in those days, we got a decent meal, so we were happy when they came. The Red Cross is the same as anything else. They do what they can, but they couldn't do much. We could hear it, not to watch it. Well, it was music. They would play the piano, or they would play an accordion or other things, or they had a group of children singing, but you couldn't watch it. We weren't allowed off from the attic. Nobody wanted to say what's happening, because everybody was frightened. We knew that next day they're taking a train to Auschwitz anyway. You can imagine, we were all sick and we didn't get much food. You know, they used to give us soup with sour cabbage. You know, we thought it was the best thing we ever ate. And then finally, towards the end, in the meantime, they kept on taking more people and more people. Very few were left in Thereseinstadt by the end of the war. And we were freed by the Russians, and they didn't have what to eat either. So they used to give us canned pork, no bread, because they didn't have. And my brother got very ill with typhus. I was in the camp for over a year. Where I come from, it was a city of 40,000 people. It was 3,000 Jews. You know how many came back? 70. There is none left anymore. 70. A lot of it was hurting me because I was best friends with a girl who wasn't Jewish, and we used to go to school together. And when the Germans came in, she wouldn't walk with me. So I didn't want to go back home ever. Never. You know, because you can't forget so fast. You never really heal. You can see. You can never. especially before the Jewish holiday. So everybody sits down. Who have I got? I have a son and a daughter and one grandchild. That's it. Look at the Canadian people. They sit down 14, 16 to a table. You know? So how do you feel? Then after 9 months, I got very sick, and I went to that place called the Mount Carmel Clinic, and then they put me to the sanatorium. The nuns were very good to me, and couldn't speak English, and I didn't know what's happening. But the nuns were very nice. And then, and a very nice elevator guy that had TB too, but he was a lot better. He used to give me comic books and tried to teach me how to read English. And then they gave me some pills from Switzerland, but it didn't work on me. I lost my eyesight for 2 weeks. So this is when they decided that they have to take lung out. For 3 years I wasn't off the bed at all. Slowly I learned English. A year and a half later I met my husband, and then we got married. He is from Romania and he was in the Israeli Navy. And he came to Canada because he had a cousin here. I wasn't supposed to have kids, but I wanted very much to have children.
Pavel Friedman wrote the poem The Butterfly in June 1942, 7 weeks after being deported to Terezin. He died in Auschwitz in September 1944. The Butterfly by Pavel Friedman. The last, the very last, so richly, brightly, dazzlingly yellow. Perhaps if the sun's tears would sing against her white stone. Such a yellow is carried lightly, way up high. It went away, I'm sure, because it wished to kiss the world goodbye. For 7 weeks, I've lived in here, penned up inside the ghetto. But I have found what I love here. The dandelions call to me, and the white chestnut branches in the court. Only I never saw another butterfly. That butterfly was the last one. Butterflies don't live here in the ghetto.
As horrific and tragic as this story is to my own family, both of my parents having been survivors and having lost, in my father's case, his entire family, his wife, his child, his father, all of his siblings, his cousins. I think that what one has to look for are the sparks of light, the people like my father who are able to find hope, to find happiness after the Shoah, to go on and enjoy life. And the people, the wonderful heroes, the courageous people who risked their lives and those of their families to save Jews during the Shoah, to look for those sparks of life.
One of the terrible temptations of being human is to be overwhelmed by numbers, by size. It's inconceivable to think of 6 million human beings, men, women, and children, deliberately, industrially exterminated by another group of human beings. It's impossible to permit oneself to dwell on the numbers, the sheer vastness of it, or even the individual sorrow that would have affected each of these victims and their extended families.
There are so many people who were able to go on. I think of my family whose family tree was not destroyed, was not obliterated from its branches down to its roots. When I look at my 4 children, and I know that they will have their own children and that family will go on, as unfortunately so many did not. And that's the victory, that although Hitler wanted to annihilate an entire people, he was not successful. That we go on and we continue to contribute to the world, and that's the positive side. That's the victory.
There is an old saying, a Jewish saying, that to save a life is as though you've saved the whole world. I paraphrase. At the same time, there is a saying that to take a life, it's as if you destroyed the whole world. I don't think it's ever possible to put the Shoah in perspective, But the thing is, I don't think it's ever possible to put the suffering of any one individual in perspective either.
It's very important to get as many stories of our survivors while we still have them. There are some people who have not yet given us their stories, told us their stories. That's important. We need to keep reminding people that when we said never again, that didn't happen, because we still have these terrible genocides that have kept continuously going on right away since 1945.
I'd say we're at a very difficult and critical time, given that the majority of the survivors are themselves no longer with us. The last few will have but a few years. I suspect that the best we can do is try and ensure that the stories are told, and told again and again and again in a whole variety of ways. To remember, but more importantly, to use the memory not simply as a signpost of what was, but rather as a starting point for what yet must be.
We have to keep educating people. We have to keep telling people that to single out anyone, whether it be for religion, for creed, for skin color, for any kind of a belief, is wrong. We have to keep educating people, and we have to keep fighting for that. We have to make sure that we educate our children from the time they are young enough to understand that we are all exactly the same.
As Romeo Dallaire said, in the midst of and after the horrific genocide in the Great Lakes area of Africa, in Rwanda and Burundi in 1994, that no human being is more human than another. And the only way we're able to remember that, the only way we're able to both honor the dead and hope for the yet to be born, is to recall that we are all part of one extraordinary, still very much unfolding story.